Hey everybody, welcome back to another map of the day. And the map we're going to be taking a look at today is called crop circles. So the general concept of what this map is supposed to be, it's supposed to be similar to Oasis in the sense that there's the majority of the wood that's in this big central clump. The key difference, however, is that there's a couple of paths that cut through the forest to give some sort of shortcuts to cut across to allies or enemies, that kind of thing. Now, if we look at the way this map is currently, we can see that the paths are fairly random, and if we keep generating, there's no real particular defined shape that the paths are going to cut through. Now, this kind of theme for a map has its merits, but if you look up anything about what crop circles are in the real world, we can see that they're not really random. They're very intentionally designed, so to speak. And that was kind of an idea that I wanted to try out and see if I could incorporate it into a new version of this map. So this kind of idea is what we're going to be pursuing in this video today. And in order to accomplish something like this, we will be relying heavily on a tool that is very good at making circular patterns of things, and that is Madlands. If you don't know what that is, click the link up here. So to start us off, we are going to need a fairly definitive boundary in which to draw in. So the way the map is currently set up is that it just creates this generic bamboo land in the middle with defined borders and just kind of lets the player lands be where they are without much constraining. So the first thing we're going to do is that we are going to make the central land a bit more consistent so we have a more defined boundary in which to draw a pattern in. So basically we're just going to take a circular pattern of lands, radius 30, base size 4, and terrain type bamboo. So we're going to get rid of this generic land in the middle and then replace it with this land pattern. And previously the connection or the paths were being drawn through the big clump of trees using this connection section, which is saying create connect all lands. I'm going to be using a different method to draw the paths in the future. And it's important to get rid of this connection statement since we just put 120 lands in here, and to create connections between all of them is going to be a little messy. So in addition to that, wherever I have the player lands, I'm going to constrain this a little more and say it's going to have a circle of 40 without any variance. So now we have our circle drawn for us. And now to fill in the circle and make the circle solid, we will need one additional land, which is also terrain type bamboo. We'll put its land right in the middle. We don't care about base size. And we will not specify number of tiles, so it will take up the entire area. So we'll get rid of these terrain thingies. So that we are just left with this nice clean circle over here. So now we can see that if we keep generating, that the central land is going to be a very consistently round shape, and that's what we were going for. So now that we have this defined boundary in which we could use to draw a pattern on, we need to think about how we want to approach that. So we can try to do a similar thing like we just did, since we have access to mad lands. If we want to draw a pattern with lands, we can attempt that. So we'll just draw a circle, the same that we were doing, but we'll just offset it by 40% in the X direction, and we'll change the terrain to farm 2, so it's not solid and units could potentially pass through it. Let's filter out the blanks, which would be out of the map. So we'll just copy these chunks of lands, and we'll see what we get. So this put forth a nice path for us, but it also affected the map in a negative way in many aspects. So for one, we didn't have any conditions to try and stop these lands from stopping at the edge of the circle, where we would probably want them to stop here so players can enter the big forest and actually continue all the way up here. And then since we defined this extra boundary, the neutral land that we put in the middle to try and fill the emptiness of the circle wasn't able to go past that. So now we have this empty patch here, which we would prefer to have filled by trees. So in order to fix that kind of a problem, we could potentially try to do things like limit the ankle boundary of the pattern to be like between 135 and 225. And we could try to limit the region where these open lands would spawn, but that would require a lot of guessing and checking. And then potentially, in order to fill this empty region, we could target this area to put a neutral land in. But then this kind of thing gets pretty complicated pretty quickly. What would be easier for us is if we didn't have to rely on lands at all, is if we could create these paths after the lands and terrains were already taken care of, and we're just painting on top of it, so to speak. And luckily, we have a way to do that, and that's with actor areas. So instead of using mad lands in this mode where it's generating physical lands, we can change it to where it's generating actor areas instead. So by using actor areas, that is going to give us a couple of advantages. So number one, it's more precise, since actor areas are generated in actual tiles instead of the percent of the map. So we'll have more precision that way. And number two, since the actor areas are being comprised in the object section, we'll have an easier time limiting what is able to spawn where, because we can use terrain stipulations because the terrains and lands have already been determined at that point. So let me demonstrate a bit what I mean by that. Let's get rid of these lands over here so we're back to this solid circle. So let's go back and try to generate the same thing as we tried to do. But instead of doing a land pattern, we will do a pattern of actor areas. So the arguments of actor areas, so the location of the actor area is going to be determined in terms of actual tiles over here. So what we are concerned about is the actor area AD, which we'll call number 1, and the actor area radius, which we will call 0. So let's grab the same pattern, and we will, instead of placing it in the land section, we will place it in the objects section. So now we have a pattern that is comprising actor area number 1. And if we want to check and see where that is, we can place some objects in there. So we'll say create object flag A. We'll place very many of them, and we'll say actor area to place in is number 1. Okay, so now we can see our flags here, and they follow pretty much the same pattern as what we were showing last time. And the benefit of doing this in the object section is that if we want the pattern to stop at the edge of the forest, then we can just add a very simple terrain stipulation on. So we can say terrain to place on is bamboo. So now, whereas previously we didn't have a good way of limiting where the lands were able to spawn when we were trying lands, it's much easier to put that limitation in the object section because we can put terrain stipulations on it. So now the pattern of our objects only exists within the bounds of the forest, which is what we were trying to achieve. Now, at this point, you might be thinking that this is pretty nice, but flags don't really help us in the way of clearing a path through a bunch of trees. And you're right, because we do need something that is capable of removing trees to provide a path for players to pass through. And what we are going to use for that is a saboteur. So we'll go up to the top here and we'll declare a constant. The saboteur is 706. So if we were to, wherever we place these flags, we have a second object we have a saboteur spawn wherever we have the flag. We can try to get that saboteur to detonate and remove all the trees in a given radius. So for this, we are going to need some RMS effects. So we'll go into the player setup section to set those up. So we'll say effect amount. We will say Gaia set attribute of the saboteur, and we want it to detonate as soon as the game starts. So we'll change its hit points to 0. So we'll say attr hit points, set those to 0. And then we want to make sure that it's capable of damaging trees. So that requires two things. So the first thing is modifying the blast ID or level to 0. And the second thing is setting attr max range to 2. So these two things in combination with each other is going to allow us to damage trees. And then the last thing we're going to do is that we're going to specify the radius in which it's going to remove the trees. So we'll say attr blast radius is going to be 2 also. And in order to test this, we're going to have to exit the scenario editor. And we're going to have to test it in a standard game. So we can see that as soon as the game starts, the saboteur is going to detonate, and it's going to remove all the trees in the radius that we specified. So it's in this way that we are going to create our nice paths through the big clump of trees, which is going to allow players to get to each other. So we're back in the scenario editor now, because it's going to be easier to see where these saboteurs spawn on the minimap when they're alive. But now that we know that these are capable of removing trees, we can go ahead and make whatever pattern we want. So I drew this little circle that cuts through the forest here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just take this same thing and adjust the offset angle slightly. So I'll say equals 72 times 1. So it just rotates itself up here a little. Now, copy this. Put it over here. adjust the angle to 72 times 2. Copy these over. (72 times 3). And then 72 times 4. So that's pretty nice looking, and we can really see where these paths are going to be taking us. Now, in addition to this, I'm going to have a couple more circles which are going to be centered around the middle of the map here. And I could potentially do that with Madlands if I wanted to, just set this X offset back to 0. But there's another way to make circles centered around a particular land, which requires a bit less code, and I'll show that. So we know that we want our circles to be centered around the middle here, and we know that we have this particular land over here, which is at the middle of the map here, position 50-50. So if we give this land ID, we can reference objects to this particular land over here. So let's say we wanted a circle of radius 20 centered around here. So we got to think about how many individual objects is it going to take to comprise a circle of radius 20. So that's pretty simple math. So if we want radius 20, we can say equals 20 squared times pi. And we can say it's going to be approximately 1257 objects to comprise the amount of objects needed for a circle of radius 20. So instead of flag A, we'll say flag B. And we'll say 1257 objects exactly. And we will say, instead of actor area to place in, we'll say place on specific land ID is 1, and we'll say find closest. So now we can see that we have flag B comprising this circle of radius 20 around the middle of the map. And if we wanted to just draw objects on the perimeter of this circle, what we can do is we can give flag B this actor area 2, because we're already using actor area number 1. We'll say actor the radius is 0. And then within this actor area 2, we will place more flags, or place flag C. We'll place as many as we can, and it's going to be actor area to place in 2. And then we will give flag C an actor area of ID 3 and radius 1. So basically what we have here, we have flag B on top of flag C. Flag C has an actor area radius of 1, while flag B has an actor area radius of 0. So if we wanted to place objects inside actor area 3, but we avoid actor area 2, that would allow us to only place objects on the perimeter of this circle over here. So we'll try that. We'll place flag A, which is a saboteur. We'll say as many as we can. Actor area to place in is going to be 3, because that's has actor areas 1, and we'll say avoid actor area number 2, because that has radius 0. So now we can see that we've drawn a bunch of saboteurs at about radius 20 at that perimeter. And we could potentially try the same thing with radius 35, which would require 38, 48 objects. So this is going to be R35. So we said 38, 48. We've already used actor areas 2 and 3, so we'll use actor areas 4 and 5 respectively. And this will comprise our circle of radius 35. And then if we wanted to finally do one at radius 50, that would require 78, 54 total objects. So we'll just start another section. What did we say? 78, 54. And we used actor areas 4 and 5, so we use 6 and 7 respectively. And now we have a circle at radius 50 approximately. And now these flags are just placeholders, and we can exchange these for invisible objects, and we'll do that. I suppose we'll do it now. So up at the top, we will define an invisible object, 1291. And for good measure, it's usually good practice to, when we use 1291, make sure we set its hit points to 0 if we're just using it as a placeholder. So set its hit points to 0. And then any place that we're using a flag, we'll say flag A, replace it with on grid, which is going to be invisible. Say replace all of those, and then replace flag B, and also flag C. So now we're just left with saboteurs, and when we generate our map, there's not going to be any flags left over. So we'll go back to a standard game to test it. So now we can see everywhere there happened to be a saboteur. The path was created for us through the forest, and unlike the first iteration of this map, the pattern is much more regular. But that comes with a caveat, is that it's kind of hard to see, since even though these paths were made through the forest, they don't show up on the minimap because this is all happening after the terrain generation section has taken place. Now, it's a fair question to ask if we are potentially able to change terrains after the game has already started. And the answer to that is yes, we can. See, anytime we build a building, for example, the foundation, what's left, is dirt 2, regardless of what terrain we happen to build on. So we happen to build on grass, but whenever we lose a building, the resulting terrain is dirt 2. So in a sense, we are able to change terrains after the game starts. And if we expanded on that idea and made a bunch of houses, we can see that we were able to change the terrain on the minimap too. So Keeping that kind of idea in mind, let's try and see what we can do to try and make these paths show up on the minimap. So back in our map script, I want to make it so in every place that we have a saboteur, I want to spawn a building in that position in order to change the terrain of that particular location for the rest of the game. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use an RMS effect. I'm going to set ATTR dead ID of the saboteur to 50, and 50 is a farm. So when we put in this RMS effect, so the saboteur is going to die as soon as the game starts, and it's going to spawn a farm. And let's see what that looks like. So when we end up spawning a farm as the dead ID of a saboteur, a couple things to notice is, number one, it does successfully change the terrain of the minimap so we can see where the paths are. But it doesn't spawn the farm as a completed building, it spawns it only as a foundation. And we can see that here. And even though that's nice looking, it's not really a viable option in terms of gameplay, because if I bring this villager over here, we're actually able to capture the Gaia farm just like any other Gaia object. Ideally, we'd be able to assign some sort of unconvertible Gaia object attribute to this farm, but we are really only able to do that with objects that we create directly with a create object command, unlike what we're doing now, which is we're just spawning the farm from as a dead unit of the saboteur, so it doesn't really work the same way. So we can try some other things. For example, when a farm foundation is removed, it leaves behind this foundation terrain. So perhaps if we were to get rid of these foundations as soon as the game starts, we'd be left with this dirt 2, which would also be a differentiable terrain. So we'll try that. So we'll use another RMS effect, which is we'll set an attribute of a farm, and we'll say a GTR creation time. We'll set it to 0. So normally when buildings are set as the dead ID, they spawn as foundations, and then setting the creation time to 0 will complete the building immediately. And then if we want to set the farm's hit points to 0, that should remove the farm right away, so we're just left with a foundation. So that's one of the ways that we can successfully change the terrain of the map after the game starts. And even though this worked for our situation, this map is supposed to be representing plowing paths through farmland. So it would be preferable to have the underlying terrain look like farmland itself. Now, that's something we're going to attempt. So back in the script, instead of setting the farm hit points to 0, I'm just going to remove that line straight out. So what we get as a result of that is just completed farms, which has a nicer looking terrain texture, but it kind of has the same problems that we saw just a little bit ago, where these are just normal Gaia objects, where if we walk up next to it, we can capture it just like any other Gaia object. And then additionally, it would prevent us, since it's a solid object, would prevent us from building anything here, which is also quite a downside. So we will try to tackle this issue with 2 steps. number one, we want to make it so we are not able to capture or interact with this object at all. So what we're going to do is we're going to upgrade it from an object which has a terrain class. So, for example, this bridge, object 605, is type 80, which is a building, and class 14, which is a terrain class. So terrain class objects are types of objects that the player cannot interact with. So if we do something like we declare the constant for a bridge and we say effect amount Gaia upgrade unit, we will upgrade the bridge into a farm. And then we will set the dead ID of the saboteur to, instead of 50, we'll set it to 605. And additionally, since we upgraded the bridge into a farm, when we want to apply this effect, which is setting the creation time, we want to apply it to the source unit, which is the bridge. So that way it will spawn as a completed farm and not as a foundation. And we can see that now, since all of these farm objects have the class of terrain, our villager is not able to capture or interact with these farms in any way. So that solves one of our problems, but we still have this issue of not being able to build on top of these farms, which is a problem also. So to fix that, the solution is actually fairly simple. We'll just take an effect amount to set ATTR radius 1 of the bridge or the farm to 0, and the same with radius 2. So effectively, this farm is not going to take up any space. So it should not block any buildings from being placed there. And we can see that after we apply that step, when we try to build walls and such in this area, we are no longer restricted from doing so. So we can still achieve what we want in the sense that the patterns are now showing up on the minimap, and now we have a nicer looking terrain underneath. And we can make this look even nicer if we go to, so we will say create terrain farm 1. Use terrain bamboo. We'll just mask farm terrain on top of the bamboo. And then after we do that, it's a much more seamless transition between the terrain underneath these bamboo trees and the terrain which is being generated by the farm objects themselves. So this next part that I wanted to talk about is not really super critical, but I still think it's worth going through. So if we were happening to spectate this game, it might be a little weird to see or potentially hear saboteurs detonating as soon as the game starts. And there is a way in which we can kind of make this a bit more seamless and make the explosion both invisible and silent. And that is by utilizing object number 94. So object 94 is an invisible unit with an attack class. So the ability to do self-destruct attacks is hard-coded to particular units that have that. So saboteurs, for example. So we can keep the saboteur unit index, and we will just simply declare constant invisible unit 94, and you will say Gaia upgrade unit. You will say upgrade the saboteur into the invisible unit. So it will keep the self-destruct properties of the saboteur, but it will be invisible. Now, importantly, a saboteur normally has 100 attack, and this Object 94 only has 10. So to ensure that this is going to damage all the trees in this radius, we're going to increase its attack slightly. So we'll be modifying the base unit, which is the saboteur. We'll say Gaia add attribute, and say AGTR attack. And we're going to be modifying melee attack, class 4. So that would be 256 times 4, and we'll just add 100 melee attack, so it would be 1124. So now we will restart this. And we can clearly see here that I'm paused at 0 seconds, and there's no explosion graphics or explosion sounds, which makes the creation of these paths a bit more seamless. And with that, we basically have all of the methodology needed to achieve what we needed. So there's basically just a lot of seemingly subtle things going on in the background just to create a few simple shapes on a map. But now that we have this methodology under our belt, we could potentially create any other sort of pattern that we might like. So we have this one, which we just went through. We could potentially have something that looks like this, or something that looks like this. And if you are at all interested in seeing how any of these play out, I would recommend that you check out Return of the Clans, which is a 3 versus 3 tournament in which this map, Crop Circles, as well as some of the other maps that I have featured on this channel at some point, you may recognize these, they're going to be played out by top-level teams. So definitely check that out. And as far as this map goes, I think I've said pretty much all I needed to say about it. So thanks everybody for watching, and I'll see you next time.